Good morning. This is World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm Ivo Daalder, the president of the council, and I am so pleased to have joining with me today Karen DeYoung, associate editor and senior national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Matt Kaminski, editor-in-chief of Politico. Matt, great to have you back.
Hi, Ivo. Good to be here.
And Philip Stephens, the director of the editorial board and chief political commentator for the Financial Times. Philip's wonderful to have you join us as well.
Great to be with you.
Well, it's been quite a week. Every week is quite a week, but this one really is different. Let's start off with what is happening in the United States, and in particular, Karen, what the global response has been. We've seen large-scale protests, large numbers of people in cities around the country protesting police brutality, systemic racism, and a whole variety of other serious problems that are affecting our country. We've seen major law enforcement activities, including calling up military forces as part of that, and quite a response around the world. Karen, why don't you start us off with where this is heading and how the rest of the world is responding to the images and the reality of what's happening here on our streets in the United States?
Well, I think it's quite amazing that this has truly become a global event. It's spread all around the world on social media, on questions being asked of government officials. Obviously, as you said, massive demonstrations in Berlin, Paris, London, Sydney, Toronto, really all around the world. There's, I think, lots of 𝘗𝘪𝘯𝘬𝘪𝘯𝘀 involved here. Lots of attempts, certainly in some places, to deflect attention from domestic problems, although in some cases, certainly in Europe and in Australia, you've had an acknowledgement by government officials that they share some of these problems of racial injustice and promising to do better. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the kind of global unpopularity of President Trump. People are happy to describe this as an erosion of U.S. moral authority, of hypocrisy from a country that is constantly calling on others to respect the freedoms that the United States insists are respected here. In those countries that are adversaries of the United States, China, Russia, Iran, you've had massive coverage in the government-controlled media, constant videos of what they clearly see as police and security forces misconduct, demonstrations, police actions, military vehicles in the streets, pictures of guys in combat gear, heavy arms, riot gear, lots of fires, beatings. You saw Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, posted a screenshot of U.S. government criticism from dating myself, from 2018, criticizing the treatment of demonstrators in the street in Iran, where he crossed out all the references to Iran and wrote in America, essentially saying these are the things the Americans criticize us of. In China, you had a senior government official just send out a kind of blank tweet, quote, "I can't breathe," end quote, in response to American criticism. Even in Europe and in allied countries, again, you've seen marches, the same posters and signs that you've seen in this country, massive marches to U.S. embassies in their capitals, and a lot of government officials, Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson, have come out and said, yeah, this is terrible what's happening in the United States. We feel really bad about it, but let's realize that we have problems here too. Places like Australia, where you see the same kind of statistics of population percentage of Aboriginals compared to the number of those incarcerated, huge numbers and huge disparities. So again, I think it's there is a little bit of Schadenfreude, a lot in some countries, but also a sort of genuine amazement and outrage at what's going on here.
Philip, the focus has really been on, sadness in some ways, outrage compared with sadness of what is happening to the country that for so long we have looked up to, and what is it in particular? Is it the racial element? Is it the military element? Is it the protesting? Is it what in particular is right in front of people's mind when they see what's happening?
Well, I think Karen's right. The reaction has been extraordinary. We've had in London 2 very large demonstrations, mostly peaceful, a little bit of violence at the edges, but mostly peaceful. You've had politicians, clergymen, people from all religions standing up to condemn the activity, the action of the police in the United States. You had the Federation of Police Chiefs of the UK expressing solidarity with the Black and other ethnic communities in the United States and also in the UK. And, Karen, of course, is right. We have our own problems. We have, a few years ago, we had riots in the streets of London. But I think there's a feeling now, taking the original, alleged murder, I suppose we still call it, with the reaction of the president and the reaction of the police or some of the police since, I think there is a genuine feeling, certainly in the United Kingdom, but from talking to friends in Germany, that this has sort of crossed the line. This has gone much further, is more shocking, if you like, than anything we've seen before. And I think, the image of President Trump standing outside the church in Lafayette Square holding the Bible with his family and aides next to him as a photo call. I mean, that sort of really stuck in people's minds as something that was very un-American, as it were. And if you talk about people in government and in sort of the office of power, the only relief has been that the chiefs of the armed forces in the United States have been seeming to exercise a little restraint with their public statements about defending the Constitution rather than a particular president. Because it is rather shocking for an outsider to see troops and Humvees and other on the streets of DC and around the White House. That this is, as people say, what happens in those other autocratic states. It doesn't happen in the United States. But I think this really is, I think, the most shocking event that I can remember in terms of the sort of the West European views of the United States.
Matt, Karen rightly talked about Schadenfreude and some of our partner countries and not so partner countries around the world, which, by the way, are quite used to using significant military force against their own people. After all, this is happening on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square in China. We've seen the riots and extraordinary violence in Iran and other places. In Russia, beating up protesters is nothing new. And yet these countries seem to see an opening here that allows them to really make a case for their own systems, for their own power and influence, and to take the U.S. a little bit down.
Well, it's, I'm struck by, and I lived through the 2005, I was living in Paris in 2005 during the sort of very widespread, and I think there, whereas I think in the US, you do have mostly peaceful protests with isolated instances of violence, where there was much more violent and caused much more damage in terms of, you had fires all over the sort of suburbs of Paris. So I think, talking to friends in Europe, I get the sense that, you're watching TV, you're not quite getting the same reality that maybe all of us are kind of living through, where you see both, in my neighborhood, there was looting, but there was also some very touching and larger sort of peaceful protests. The more striking point for me is that, yes, you had the Chinese and the Russians almost gleeful about, seeing this happen and being very active on social media with their bots or pushing misinformation. There was a little bit of schadenfreude with, obviously, there's an element of the French intellectual elite that sort of loves to kind of poke at America. This has been a theme for generations now. But I think the reaction that we've had in Europe is a reminder of how powerful actually America still is as an idea, as a driver of the global conversation, that, soft power still is there. And it comes at a time when we are in the middle of possibly the first global crisis where America is not seen to be in the lead. We haven't led the kind of global response to coronavirus, actually kind of gotten out of the WHO. We haven't really, I think, been at the lead in terms of coordinating an economic response, but there is still something about America as being kind of the center of attention in the world. Over an incident that seems very local to Minneapolis, does speak to a national conversation about race that's been going on for a long time. But the fact that it resonates in London and Paris, we have much bigger demonstrations in the streets over this than you had over incidents that were sort of French incidents or British incidents in the past, I think is a reminder that for all we talk about sort of diminished American standing in the world, I don't see any other country that even comes close to the sort of sway that the U.S. has culturally, politically, in every other sense in the global conversation.
So in one, I think that's true, and in one area where it seems to have been resonating significantly beyond the violence and by law enforcement authorities and the racism that exists is the issue of journalists being attacked by the police, and a sense of outrage coming from Australia, from other countries, of all places, Turkey, probably the one place that puts more journalists in jail than any other. But we've seen these pretty shocking images as well of brutality against the press, Karen, that are really undermining this sense of what is happening to the United States, the country that, after all, is the only country that has in its own constitution press freedom guaranteed in ways that are quite unique and quite novel and quite important.
Well, I think the one thing that got particular attention was on Monday evening with the what happened in and opposite Lafayette Park in Washington, where you had an Australian broadcasting crew with a guy clearly with a TV camera on his shoulder, a woman with a microphone in front of her, and you saw a black-clad riot forces with big shields, intentionally, I think it was pretty clear, intentionally running into the cameraman, shoving the shield in him. One guy chasing the reporter with a baton, and this obviously caused a lot of consternation in Australia and a protest by the government. We've seen it all over the place. We've seen it with our own journalists. We have many, many people in the streets. And we saw the CNN reporter who was arrested for basically standing there doing his job in New York and just asking the police where he should stand to be safe and to get out of their way. I think it reminded a lot of us who have reported overseas in situations like this of the way journalists get treated, and you learn in many circumstances very quickly that you do need to get out of the way because you really don't have any protection. And I think that this is shocking not only to Americans, but to people around the world.
I can just come in. Matt was saying this is a sort of demonstration of American power still, and I'd agree with that entirely. America in many ways is still the indispensable nation, and if you're a European, you look at the choices between the United States or others. It's I think what's really shocking, though, for Europeans is this sense that this is happening with the encouragement, if not the incitement, of the White House. I think a lot of people who have not liked Donald Trump, not liked his policies, have sort of put it, have just sort of put it to one side. I think this has brought home something about this guy is completely different, in his attitudes to law and order, in his attitudes to Black and minority communities, and his attitudes to freedom of the press and to freedom in general, to law and order. I think that's a big change.
I think if I may just add to that too, I thought the most remarkable thing this week, or one of the many remarkable things this week, was the statement from Jim Mattis, who cannot be dismissed as a millennial Bernie bro, but is in fact a four-star general who was Trump's Secretary of Defense. And for him to come out and say, this is the first president that in my lifetime who actively is seeking to divide the country in a moment of crisis, I think that will sort of resonate with the military, and it'll resonate a lot with people, with the few people in this country who are still on the fence politically. And I think that is going to define Trump in ways that I think Trump is going to really be resentful of sort of being defined as, he's sort of lost. He's starting to lose people that he was able to count on as at least being quietly supportive.
I would just support both of those points. I think that, the fact is that there's not a lot of love for President Trump around the world, and that these actions seem to conform to what people in other countries and governments in other countries already think about him. We're close to an election, everybody's watching it, and I think that we can't discount that in terms of both public opinion and government opinion overseas as they watch this happening. It seems to be sort of conforming to type or stereotype, however you want to play it. But I think that is a big factor.
Matt, one place where this is playing out is on the question of whether there will be a G7 meeting. The G7 been around since 1975 in its current format since 1977. And Angela Merkel, even before the really striking events of the weekend, had already said that she was not going to come to the meeting, ostensibly because she didn't want to travel because of the coronavirus. But there was more behind that, and I think it reflects some of the discussion that we've had, and Matt, the points that you made.
Well, I will do a little bit of plug here. That there's a story that Politico broke out of Europe, is that Angela Merkel sort of had a very tense conversation with him, and they disagreed over the Nord Stream pipeline, a couple other things. But I think primarily what we heard from officials close to her, and what you hear from other European officials, is they're also very aware this is an election year. They don't want to be props for campaign photos, and they're going to stay, I think, very far away from him this election year. That's a separate issue, in fact, from the future of the G7, and I think it comes from, as much as the U.S. does still is the loudest party on the planet, and seems to have this kind of force that emanates out, and things happen here obviously resonate overseas. There is a lack of leadership. And there are sort of kind of huge existential question marks over not just the future of the G7, but the future of NATO, of these other institutions that were created really to kind of to sort of run that post-war global order. And I think that question will not be resolved even if Biden comes into office. I think those questions will continue to linger over NATO. The G7 as such, are those the seven? Trump wants to bring in Australia, Russia, which Boris Johnson has already told him he will not allow. The Canadians are going to veto that too. But that group of nations seems a little bit of a anachronistic club. But then how do you agree on who comes in there? And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is, how does the Western democracies come together against China? And so you have personality issues around Trump. You have a turn against internationalism in the U.S. that, by the way, spans both parties and was a characteristic of the Obama era. And three, you really don't have a unified stance on China within the G7, the G10, however you want to group these countries together. So I think there's sort of bigger issues around the future of these institutions that will, live beyond Trump, depending on how long he stays in power.
Philip, how do you see this? Is this a G7 issue? Is it a global governance issue from London's perspective, of course, not being part of the EU anymore, being part of the big boys or the big guys is important. And the G7 is one of those institutions.
Yeah, I think for the UK in particular, now the G7 takes on more importance because we've left one club and we can't afford, if you like, for another of the important clubs to fall into abeyance. But to take Matt's point, I think the European view of the G7 is that potentially it is still very important. And the question you hear, and I heard this from a European foreign minister the other day, is we see, it's not just China, we see across the world authoritarian, autocratic regimes pushing forward, pushing at the limits of what's sort of acceptable or going beyond them. And you could say this about Turkey as much as, among allies as well. And so which are the countries that are going to start standing up again for democratic values, for freedom, for the rule of law, for international institutions? And the G7, this foreign minister continued to me, is the obvious place to do that. But you can only do that if the biggest, most important member of the G7 wants to do that. If the US administration wants to play a leadership role, wants to be the representative of the democracies. So, to put it bluntly, you have, I think, European foreign ministries and some of the Sherpas thinking about, if there is a new president, these are ways that we can reinvigorate the G7. And these are ways in which we might be able to extend it to a D10, certainly not Russia. It's seen, I think, as the starting point for democratic values and for the democratic states. But I think, frankly, if President Trump is re-elected, then you won't find Europeans paying much attention to the G7 because they know that the president doesn't want that sort of leadership of the democratic nations that his European partners and indeed Canada want as well, and Japan. So, I think Europe wants above all a return to global governance and a return, I think, and we'll talk about China, I think, in a bit, a return to sort of standing up for values. That's only possible if the US within the G7 and also actually in the G20 is prepared to be the leader of that effort.
Karen, of course, President Trump, in responding to Merkel's decision to not come to Washington for the G7, said, well, the G7 really isn't a very important and outdated instrument anyway, and we need to enlarge it and importantly, not only get some of the democratic allies in Asia, you talked about Korea and Australia, perhaps India being part of it, but importantly, Russia needs to be part of it too. What's the motivation here? Is it all about Russia, or is it about a new form of global governance?
It's hard to figure out, because if you look at the countries that he listed, of course, the second time he mentioned it, he didn't mention Russia. He just talked about Australia, South Korea, India. So it's hard, again, as often is the case, it's hard to figure out what he's talking about. But he's been pushing to bring Russia back in for some time. You'll recall that they all agreed after the Crimea annexation that Russia could no longer be a member. That hasn't changed. The administration officially is still committed to reincorporating Crimea into Ukraine. And so it's hard to see what Trump's excuse is for doing that. At the same time, you see the G20, which was an organization that was actually started to answer some of these questions that Trump has been raising about, you need to include more, you need to include more countries. There are lots of big countries with lots of influence that need to be included in this group. But I think Philip's point is the correct one. You're talking about countries that are supposed to be democratic countries that combine the economic and the democratic roots in a way that give them some leadership cachet in the world. I thought it was fascinating that Trump said, well, first of all, we're going to postpone this and not have it because of the virus, then said, oh, we are going to have it. We're going to have it at Camp David. No, we're not going to have it at Camp David. We're going to have it in Russia, I mean, at the White House. And then basically, you know, the most public about it, but I think basically all of them said, no, we're not coming. And Trump was then forced to say, well, I've decided I'm going to postpone this until the fall. So I think that, you know, this is Trump's idea of exerting leadership, saying, we are going to meet, I'm going to invite these people, and everybody else saying, no, thanks.
Well, that's the striking thing, right? It is the no thanks. It's a pretty remarkable time when the Chancellor of Germany turns down a meeting in the White House with the President of the United States. It doesn't happen every day. Karen, staying with you for a minute and switching slightly over to China, because one of the, of course, underlying reasons why the President suggested the need to broaden the G7 was to have an anti-China coalition. And so the question there is, why have an anti-China coalition? What have the Chinese been up to in the past few weeks? We've seen some serious changes, and with regard to Hong Kong, some military actions in the South China Sea and Taiwan in other places. What is happening with the Chinese as we have been internally focused and have our usual tiffs among allies?
Well, you know, you said that this is, you know, every week has been an incredibly momentous week in the past several months, and this one especially. I even had to write down some notes of everything that's happened vis-a-vis China because I thought I couldn't remember it all. I mean, you started with Trump certainly escalating his rhetoric, if not necessarily his substance in every aspect vis-a-vis China. He announced once again that China had ripped off the United States in trade, and had allowed the virus to spread all over the world, that the United States was dropping out of the World Health Organization because it was dominated by China. I mean, some people said, what a way to ensure that it's dominated by China if in fact you drop out. The United States said it would begin the process of eliminating Hong Kong special status in the United States in trade and visas and finance, but didn't actually do anything about it, just again saying we're going to be starting this process. Said they would eliminate visas from Chinese students, came down on India's side in a border dispute that the Chinese and the Indians have been having for decades over their shared borders in the Himalayas. In the South China Sea, the Chinese again have been asserting their control of all the areas that border on a lot of other countries that other countries have complained about. In this case, it was Malaysia. This week, the United States UN ambassador sent a letter to the Secretary General asking that it be distributed to all members, once again saying that what China is doing is illegal, that the United States and other countries will protect freedom of navigation. I think certainly you had Taiwan, where the Chinese came out again and said, stop talking about independence, we will crush you. You had obviously Hong Kong, the 31st anniversary of Tiananmen, where Secretary Pompeo had some of the participants into his office in Washington, came out with a very strong statement. But again, the Chinese have been moving with this legislation to criminalize certain things in Hong Kong, cracking down on demonstrations, saying that certain crimes would be punished on the mainland, and basically breaking the terms of the agreement of Hong Kong's special status. So I think that the Chinese are seeing this opportunity with what they perceive as a lessening of U.S. authority and a sort of conundrum for Trump, where he really wants this trade agreement to go through. At the same time, he wants to crack down on China. And so, China is using that time to push ahead with many of the things that it wants to do in terms of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and basically increasing its own leadership role in the world at the expense of the United States.
Matt, I think that besides, I think it's important. It's this idea that this, in just in the last few weeks, we see this extraordinarily confident China moving forward on multiple fronts to challenge, it seems to me, in some ways, American prerogatives, American influence, American power. And it sort of almost feels like 1947, 1948, when you had the Soviet Union starting to push in all kinds of places, of course, in Europe and primarily. And this realization in Washington, America, this is serious. We really need to figure out a way to deal with a China that has become no longer just a potential partner, but really a real adversary.
I remember talking to some people in the administration a few months, even before this whole crisis, and they were sort of referring to China as the great existential threat to the republic, not even just in this moment, but really to the long-term survivability of the United States, which was, for me, was very striking. I think there are a lot of people who genuinely see China as kind of a slow-rolling and a far more formidable, potentially, adversary than the Soviet Union ever was, because it is both an economic and a technological power, as well as a rising military power and regional power. So I think that's a debate that will rage on, and is obviously raging on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. And as there's so much noise around American politics, I do think there is, at the same time, there is a conversation that is going on with, and actually a serious conversation about how do we really address this Chinese threat. It seems to me that really there are two possible outcomes here, and they don't actually depend on who wins in November. I think there's a group of people who really do think that after the noise over you brought us COVID, you're causing us trouble and sort of trade, that we will need to find some sort of accommodation with China, because it is not in our interest to have a sort of full-on clash, either economic or geopolitical interest of a full-on clash with China. I think there are people on the Republican and Democratic side who are thinking through what a China reset might look like. For those who remember the Russia reset with President Obama, George Bush also tried a Russia reset, know that usually doesn't actually work out very well. So I think the other scenario, which I think people are really at the foremost of mind, is this going to escalate to a point where you might have a clash that could be even a military clash? And I've never before heard so many people who are serious people talk openly about the potential of even a war with China one day if things continue in this direction. So I don't think part of what China is doing right now is obviously opportunistic with Corona, but there are plans for Hong Kong to change the security law. These were drawn up before this all started, and I think the timing was more or less supposed to be around now anyway, and they can say they have the cover of Corona. So the third element here, which I think is important to emphasize, is we really don't yet have a Western consensus on how to face up to China. What's been so interesting is that there's been some shifts in Europe where I think the Europeans have tended to be more on the accommodationist side, the Germans especially. I think they have as much foreign direct investment in China as in the rest of the EU. and there's been a kind of obviously a fight between the Trump administration and Europe over Huawei, how tough to be on Huawei, should commercial interests or political interests win out. But I think you are seeing a shift that may outlast this crisis in this presidential terms. We have leading voices in Europe becoming much more hawkish on China, and most dramatically in Philip's country, where under the Cameron-Osborne regency, you essentially had a let's hug the Chinese as close as possible and hope some of the gold rubs off on us, to now having the party in power become very hawkish on China, and there is potentially partners for us that we could ally with to have a sort of more of a unified China policy.
Philip, how is this seen from Europe? In the first instance, how do Europeans look at what the Chinese are doing, and secondly, on the question of what they should be doing about it?
Okay, well, I think take up Matt's last point. There's a big shift underway in European attitudes towards China. Now, for about a decade, Europe has seen China as an economic opportunity and said we can leave the geopolitics to the United States. That has now changed. Europeans have woken up to China's geopolitical ambitions, not just in Asia, but in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, in using one belt, one road as a route, if you like, into Europe. They've seen the ruthlessness with which China uses disinformation campaigns, this is over COVID, to promote its ways. And in Hong Kong, again, China's willingness to abrogate an international agreement. So this change has been underway for some time, but I think it's in the last 2 or 3 months, it's really crystallized. And of course, as Matt said, the biggest visible change is seen in the UK, which was essentially craven in its attitudes towards China until quite recently. I don't think Boris Johnson is the sort of leading this. He's being driven by his own party in Parliament into taking a much tougher line. But in Germany too, you see quite a big shift, and even in France, which has always looked for the economic opportunities. Now, Mrs. Merkel cancelled another summit this week. The President Xi was due to come to Leipzig in September for a summit of the EU 27, chaired by Mrs. Merkel. Mrs. Merkel this week cancelled that, said, as she did with the G7, this was because of COVID and it was all too difficult. But behind the scenes, German and other European diplomats have said, it's a summit we didn't want to have at this moment, so it's much more convenient. The fear is that, though, that the US and the president will lead the West into a needless conflict. So I think what you have in Europe now is, yes, we need to be much more robust. Yes, we'd like to do some diplomacy with the US. And does Mike Pompeo ever want to talk to us as opposed to just shout at us? And there is possibly, an opportunity here for a more concerted Western front, but it can't survive the sort of unpredictability of tweets from the White House. It has to be strategic and coherent. So again, I fear that Europe is never going to face a choice between the US and China. The US is our military ally, a big democracy, when Europe is never going to say we prefer China. But the question is whether Europe and the US work together as not an adversary of China, because we all need China. If we want to deal with climate change, with pandemics, with all these big international problems, we need to find a way to cooperate while we compete with China. But what I think the Europeans fear is competition becomes confrontation, becomes conflict. And so I think, again, perhaps with another administration, there would be an opportunity to build a tougher, more robust policy towards China, which allowed, if you like, for us to to stand up for democratic rights in Hong Kong, but also in China, for people to meet the Dalai Lama again, for people to say, look, the suppression of Muslims in Xinjiang is unacceptable. But at the same time, look, we're still going to do business, we're still going to have trade, and we're still going to deal internationally with the problems that we need to, that are mutually beneficial. That's the policy I think Europeans are now beginning to grasp for. And as I say, I think there is an opportunity. Whether it will be taken, we'll have to see.
Karen, we only have a few minutes left, and I think one of the issues that will, as Philip said, really make a problem with the coordination of strategy with the Europeans is if we move from confrontation to conflict. And I'm struck by Taiwan becoming increasingly the issue over which we may have a serious difference with our allies, but also, it seems to me, with China, with the Chinese not only saying they would crush the independence movement, as you mentioned, but also remove the word peaceful in front of their goal of reunification. What are you hearing in Washington in terms of a concern that this may indeed escalate, as Matt suggested, to a military confrontation?
Well, I think it's interesting that this is one of the few issues where there is wide bipartisan support for Taiwan. This is an issue where the administration and Congress across the board seem to agree. If anything, I think that there, in some quarters in Congress, is even more support for Taiwan and for standing up for Taiwan and pushing for Taiwan independence than there is in the administration itself. So it's something that I think that, again, as has been said many times in this conversation about China, there has to be a strategic look at this and not something that just responds to the day's events and puts us in a position where we have to act or where our allies feel that we've gone too far. So I think that, again, this is something that the administration has to treat very carefully. I'm not sure they're doing that right now, but the fact that Taiwan does have widespread support, both as the underdog, as the democracy. You know, they just had an election. There was overwhelming praise for that election. We've just sent new arms there. So I think that you know, there is a tendency in this country to push toward support for Taiwan. Whether that moves all the way to support for independence, I think remains to be seen. But again, as Philip said, a lot of these things start to take on a life of their own if you don't have a strategic plan for how to deal with it.
Karen DeYoung, Philip Stephens, Matt Kaminski, thanks all three for really an excellent conversation. I can be sure that next week we will be talking about many, not only of the same issues, but others as well. The world is not standing still, even as we are dealing with multiple crises of racism, of pandemics, and economic crisis. And we'll be back next week at World Review at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Again, thanks all for joining us, and hope you have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Ivo.
Thank you.